And I know this morning, again, I say this morning because it's my time. I know that a webinar about meetings isn't the sexiest of topics. But I think we all know, as Duncan just said, how important this really is. I mean, the truth is, as leaders, as pastors, we spend a lot of time in meetings. And we all know the agonizing torture of a lousy meeting that is unproductive and a waste of time. And it has been famously said that if you want to kill time, a meeting is a perfect weapon. So I want to begin by asking you to imagine a scene. So you're sitting in a meeting and you're coming to the end of the meeting. Like let's say it's 1:55 in the afternoon and the meeting is supposed to end at 2 o'clock. And you can feel yourself beginning to get restless. You begin shutting down your computer, putting your stuff in your backpack. You sort of discreetly glance at your phone and see a couple of text messages that have come in, and your mind is already shifted to the rest of your day. Well, finally, the meeting wraps up at 2:04 and everybody begins to walk out the door, and no one ever stops to ask, so was that a good meeting? Did we accomplish what we needed to? Was it an effective and productive use of our time? And I want to tell you a little story, and again, this has to stay just between us, but when I was at Saddleback, sometimes Rick, he was a spontaneous guy, and sometimes he was wanting to have a meeting, and he would literally gather who happened to be in the office or walking down the hall. And I'd walk into this meeting, and there'd be 15 to 20, 22 people in the meeting sometimes. And then we would just have this aimless, meandering meeting for 2 to 3 hours. And I remember in some of my most cynical moments, I would add up how much money we spent on that meeting. And I would sometimes walk out and go, that was not a $5,000 meeting. That was a $50 meeting. Well, we've all known what it's like to be in those kind of meetings. And apparently, we're not the only ones who are frustrated by ineffective meetings. In fact, I found this statistic. I think you're going to see it. Professionals lose 31 hours a month in unproductive meetings. I mean, think about that. That's roughly 4 work days. And research indicates that 50% of the time that we spend in meetings is not productive. In one study, 73% said they actually brought other work to do during their meetings, and 39% at some point during a meeting, I've actually dozed off. Well, here's what I know to be true. Your church spends a lot of valuable time and resources on meetings. You and your team want to be effective and productive. And as Duncan said, meetings are how we get stuff done. It's a necessary function for moving vision forward. And it's discouraging and frustrating to walk away from meetings that felt like, wow, we missed the target. It was a waste of time. But I have got great news because I think with just a few small tweaks, you and I can better steward people's time and our organization's resources and the effectiveness of our impact. So let me get really practical. And you may not know this, but I'm actually an expert on this topic because I have sat in 50 years of ministry in thousands of meetings. And I've been the victim of a lot of bad meetings. But the honest truth is, I've not only been the victim, but I've also been the perpetrator. I have led a lot of bad meetings and I have victimized other people. So this whole session flows out of the pain I have personally experienced and sometimes inflicted on others, but it flows also from a desire to get better. So let me jump into some things I'm learning, some best practices that may help you and I as we think about leading our meetings. After sitting in thousands of meetings, the most important part of any meeting is the landing. And yet, it is usually the most neglected part of any meeting. In fact, I think it is the norm to walk out of a meeting without clear decisions, without clear action steps, and without clear deliverables. So I travel a lot for what I do in ministry. And I've not only sat in a lot of meetings, but I've been on thousands of flights. And I've never one time been on a flight where the pilot neglected the landing. I mean, it doesn't matter how good the snacks are, or how good the in flight movie is, or how clean the restrooms are. If you don't land the plane well, the flight is a disaster. And by the way, this is a bit of a sidebar. It's the pilot's job to land the plane. It's not the passenger's responsibility. In the same way, I think if you and I are leading a meeting, I have to assume the role of the pilot. It's your job to make sure that the meeting lands well and you get clear decisions. As far as meetings go, it doesn't matter how good the agenda is or how good the snacks are or even how robust the discussion is. If you don't land the meeting well, it's a disaster. So I've developed a strategy to help meetings that I lead land well. A crash landing isn't good for a plane and it's not good for a meeting. And so I think landing a meeting well takes a little bit of time. So here's my best practice I want to share with you. Set aside the last 10 to 15 minutes to allow for a smooth and effective landing. And there are three questions that I've learned to ask. So in my mind, is that the meeting's coming toward the end and we get to that 10 or 12-minute mark. In my mind, I take a mental shift because now I'm wanting to land the plane and have an effective ending to the meeting. So here's the three questions I'm trying to make sure we ask in the last few minutes of the meeting. So here's number one. What did we decide? I'm amazed how many times I've walked out of a meeting and I thought we made a decision on something, but other people who sat in the meeting didn't think we'd landed a decision. So I went out and started acting on the decisions I thought we made. But as you know, that can cause a lot of confusion and chaos and even conflict. And by the way, sometimes that has made me pretty unpopular with my teammates. So before you leave the meeting, I think it's really important to get really clear on what is still a discussion and what's actually a decision. What's a decision? Because if it's a decision, we can act. If it's a discussion, we're still just beating it up. So, to use a football analogy, it's the difference between standing in the huddle and talking and chatting with my teammates and actually running the play. When we're in the huddle, we're discussing options and possibilities, but running a play means we've made a decision and we're now free to move into action on the pitch. But there is one moment that signals the transition from a huddle to the play. And the moment is when the referee puts the ball into play. At that instant, everyone moves into action. So again, imagine this scene, everyone's standing around in a huddle on the pitch, and the goalie runs over to the referee, grabs the ball, and starts dribbling toward the other team's goal. It's not exactly the most effective way to run a play. In football, it's important for everybody to know their role and to be clear so that they can begin to execute. And I've been in and unfortunately led lots of staff meetings where it wasn't clear if the ball had been put in play. It wasn't clear whether or not a decision has been made. And there's nothing more frustrating than when you think you're still in the huddle just talking about options and you see a teammate dribbling the ball down the field. So, the older I get, I've noticed something about myself. When I lead meetings, I find myself pushing for clear decisions. So, let me give you an example that's very fresh with me. Just this week, I was in a meeting with a church staff of a large church here in the States, and the executive pastor was facilitating the meeting. And they spent way too much time down in the weeds discussing details, minor things, minutia. And I was sitting there wishing the XP would have taken a stronger role as the pilot of the meeting and forced them to stay on topic, and that I wish he had been a little bit more decisive. And I've been in lots of meetings where I feel like we just keep circling the mountain and we get right to the edge of a decision, but nothing is ever definitively decided. And I've also been in lots of meetings where we end up rehashing everything we discussed in the last meeting. And because we have an amazing ability to all interpret things differently, it's not only helpful to ask the question, what did we decide? But to maybe even write down some of those decisions. And then there's a second question I begin to ask. Who needs to know what we decided? So, in what I do with Replenish, I've sat with lots of church teams and had the chance to interview them about, their staff team and their staff culture. And when you begin to talk about gaps or weaknesses, there's something that almost always comes into the conversation, and it is a lack of good internal communication. Um, this has the direct correlation to what did we decide, because if decisions aren't clear, then there's no way that communication will be clear or accurate. George Bernard Shaw once said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And man, I've lived there where I thought I was clear. I thought we were communicating, and everybody's sitting out there looking at you a little bit confused. In most churches I've worked with, supervisors, pastors would give themselves higher scores for communication than the volunteers or staff who also work in the organization. So the question, who needs to know what we decided, forces me to think about the issue of communication. Because I think what happens, because I'm busy, I've got a lot on my plate. Most of the time, when I have left a meeting, I've moved on to the next meeting or the next task. And I don't take the time to think about my team members and how the decisions that we just made in that meeting are going to impact them. I remember Rick Warren used to talk about this a lot, that people love to be in the know, and they love to be in the know about decisions that impact them. And Rick used to famously say, what people are not up on, they're down on. In other words, when they're not included, they feel devalued, feel left out. And let's be honest, when you're in the know, when you are communicated with early on, it demonstrates value. But the flip side is also true. When we under communicate, it will make our teammates, our volunteers, our key leaders feel devalued. Um, so Patrick Lencioni, who's written a lot about teams, and if you want to get better at teams, I would highly encourage you to read some of his material. But Lencioni talks about this, and he says we must learn the practice of and discipline of cascading communication down through the organization. I love that word cascading because it gets to the idea that there are layers and there are ripples to our communication. And I think as a staff member, and I walk out of a meeting, one of my assignments from the meeting is to communicate decisions that we made with those that I work for. And we all know this, like a few minutes of communication on the front end of a decision will help everything go so much more smoothly, will help execution and save a lot of time cleaning up messes because we didn't communicate. All right, let me give you a third question I'm trying to get in the discipline of asking in that last few minutes of the meeting. Who's responsible and what are the key deliverables? As important as it is to have good decisions and clear communication, it's also important to know who is owning the action steps that we're coming out of that meeting with. Because ultimately, all ideas and decisions become work that somebody has to own. And I'll sometimes when I'm teaching on this, I'll say to a church team, when everybody owns it, nobody owns it. So when it comes to an action item, I'm going, all right, who's taking responsibility to drive this forward and to see that this gets done? So again, to go back to our football analogy, it's deciding which part of the play or which role every person on the team is going to play. Sometimes the responsibility is obvious because of people's roles, but sometimes it's not always obvious. It could go to two or three different people in the room, and that's when I think clarity is really, really important. And again, I personally like to write things down. Like, here's the action step that we've agreed to. Here, Tom is going to own this. And then here's the date that the person will commit to having the action item completed. So again, going back to the meeting I was in just a couple of days ago, there was this long list of action steps, but I couldn't see where there was any kind of clear deadline or accountability to make sure that those action steps get completed. And I know these questions might feel a little bit tedious, but man, they can move what is good discussion to actually good progress and greater effectiveness. And again, if you're a smaller team, some of this might feel a little like overkill, but what I would encourage you to do is still take the concepts we're talking about and customize them to fit your size and your situation. Again, I think about your team meetings like raw electricity, and all of your people are coming in and they're bright and they're gifted and they have insights and there's endless potential and possibility. But random electricity can also be dangerous and harmful. And so, for electricity to be useful, it needs a transformer. And I like to think of that last 10, 12 minutes of a meeting as the transformer that takes all of our good ideas, all of our great discussion, and actually directs it in a way that's now useful for your organization or your church. So, the landing really matters. But let's back up a minute. I'd say the landing is most important, but you also need a smooth takeoff. Like sometimes we all walk into a meeting and maybe it's a recurring meeting and we're not even clear what it is we're trying to accomplish. So a question I like to ask, you see there on the slide is, so what's the win? Like what will have made it worth us investing this time and these resources and having this meeting. And I think what that does is it aligns everyone's expectation and defines what is success for the meeting. Um, so another way to ask this is what outcomes would make this meeting worth the investment of our time? And so sometimes when I'm leading a meeting, I get, a marker and I get up at the whiteboard and I go, all right, even though we might meet every week, what's the win for today's meeting? And usually I have an idea or two, but somebody else might also have something they really need to get done, and that helps inform what is already maybe on my agenda. Um, so the first and most important part of any meeting is the landing, and the takeoff matters, obviously, but I would make the case that the second most important part of any meeting, and this is not intuitive, but it's the 10 minutes after the meeting. The second most important part of any meeting is the 10 minutes after a meeting. So I've had this experience so many times. Even when I'm leading a meeting, I'm in a rush to get to my next meeting, and I don't really take the time to capture everything that needs to happen. So again, go back to my illustration about an airplane flight. Whenever a pilot lands the plane at the jetway, he doesn't just walk out of the plane. No, the pilot is usually the last person to leave the plane because there's paperwork to fill out. And the same thing is true with meetings. Just like that pilot, after you've landed the plane, it's important for you to take some time to jot down some notes from the meeting. Um, I would encourage you that if you are a pastor, to start scheduling some buffer times between meetings. For years, I went from one meeting to the next, to the next, to the next. But if you'll leave that 10 minutes, one, you need a little space in your brain to transition to the next thing, but also it allows you to capture what did we decide, who needs to be communicated with, what are the key action items, and who's responsible. Is there anything that me as the facilitator of the meeting needs to follow up on before the next meeting? And then, by the way, I take all those notes that I captured at the end of that meeting and I put them at the start of my agenda for the next week's or the next month's meeting, where we can review decisions we made, we can review did communication happen, we can talk about deliverables, and we can actually hold people accountable for getting stuff done. All right, so those are some best practices that I'm trying to implement as I lead meetings, but I want to leave you with kind of one final thought. And it's something I learned from Patrick Lencioni. Learn to separate the strategic from the tactical. I feel like one of the things that has caused me to have ineffective meetings through the years is trying to blend talking about high level, forward thinking, major issues and initiatives, and also talking about now who's doing the announcements in this week's weekend service and who's in charge of the slides. And we use two different sides of our brains for these different functions. Um, And I think meetings are part of life in any organization. And if you're going to move, the organization forward as a pastor and with your key leaders, you need some dedicated time where you're talking about the one or two or three most important things coming up in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months. And you get plenty of unhurried time to have discussion and prayerfully discern what you and your organization should be. And I feel like most of the church teams I sit with, they don't get enough of this time. And so, like, I would say at least once a quarter, every 6 months, you need a half a day, maybe a day and a half to do strategic thinking and planning with your team. And then you need on a more regular basis to have those tactical down in the weeds, getting clear on how you're launching groups, what Easter's going to look like all of those kinds of more day-to-day, week-to-week kinds of meetings. And I just found it helpful to separate those out from each other. They don't do well when they coexist in the same meeting. So here's my final quote. It's in my High Impact Teams book. Execution is what fills the gap between intention and progress. And when we have good meetings, we set up our team and our organization to have good execution so that we're not walking around with just good dreams and hopes and vision, but no, we're actually have a plan because we came out of our meeting with a plan that we're going to actually make progress. Now, you've had access to a couple of handouts, so let me take 30 seconds to just talk about these. It's a way for you to evaluate 9 different components of an effective meeting. And because we all see and interpret words and language differently, the second handout actually gives you descriptions of, the 9 different components. And so, what I would love for you to do is take this and maybe do a self-assessment, but also take it back to your team and have them fill in each one of those 9 components in the little circle with a red, yellow, or green. A green meaning we're killing it. This is going well in our meetings. Yellow means, it's not terrible, but it's not great. And red means, yeah, we really could use some work on this. It's not working very well. And so I think it's just a great little tool for you to have some great conversation with your team about it. So again, that's all my time. I just want to take a moment though and personally invite you to our events that are going to be happening later in May next month in Chorley and then in Milton Keynes. I would love to be able to meet you in person and would love to get acquainted with you. Thank you for what you're doing in the local church and for your leadership. So, Duncan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lance. That's so helpful. Yes, make sure you've booked into the on the road events we're doing with Lance in May, as he said in Chorley and Milton Keynes. Matt's going to put on the chat exactly where you can register for that. It's a whole day workshop on healthy and strategic leadership, and it's free, absolutely free. We'll even give you lunch, which is amazing. So we'd love to see you there. Make sure you're booked in for that. If you've got some questions, already people are dropping a few in the chat. If you've got some questions, please carry on doing that. I've got a couple off the back of what you've said there, Lance. I was a friend of mine runs a really large church in the States, and he asked me to meet him at the end of his regular staff meeting. And what I experienced blew my mind. He said, "Just come in." I was standing outside, and I saw he was finishing up with his staff, and he kind of beckoned for me to come in. And I stood for the last 10 minutes of the meeting, and just hearing you talk about the last 10 minutes, one of the questions that he asked the team was bit of feedback. How do you feel the meeting went? Where did we dip? Where was there energy? Where are you not clear? And I said to him afterwards, "Is that something you just did for my benefit? Do you do it like occasionally?" He said, No, we do it every week. We have honest feedback on the meeting." And so everybody says it was frustrating because Bob said he was going to prepare something and he never did. And so we never were able to discuss or decide on that point. I just wanted to, I mean, do you ever do that kind of feedback? Have you seen that kind of honest feedback about how from your team about how the meetings are going? Would you ever do that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I don't know that I personally would do it every week. I think having a dedicated time to really assess, like, hey guys, as we think about our meetings, how have they been? I think sometimes in the moment also, I don't want to throw some other teammate under the bus, like, hey, Bob overtalked and dominated the time. But a week later, we can debrief and we don't have to talk about Bob specifically, but we could talk about, hey, one of the problems we have is we've got some people who end up dominating the time. I think one of the things that you're probing around on that churches don't do well, though, is we don't normalize candid feedback.
Yeah.
We play nice, and as a result, people hold their frustrations and they're not really sure, like, hey, is it okay if we actually express and again, the frustration is not to, demean anybody, but it's to help us get better. And so I think what is brilliant about that is that that question normalizes, like, hey, we want feedback. And I think it helps the leader to also go, hey, if I've got a blind spot, maybe the team can help point it out. So I would definitely do that. I don't know if about every week, but I
Yeah.
would certainly, I think that's great.
I love that idea of normalizing feedback. It's not
Yeah.
just a shocking thing we do at Christmas and review the
Yes.
year. It's like,
Yes.
yeah, we normalize this idea of being honest in our feedback. It would make such a difference. Great question from my friend Simon here. What about those people who get bogged down in trivia and get off the agenda and take us down
Ah,
side
yeah.
street? How do you
That's
steer it back?
yeah. I think there's a couple of ways. I think one would be as the pilot of the meeting, I feel like I've got to take stronger control. And too often in the past, I've let, like in the meeting I was just in a couple of days ago, they rabbit trailed down talking all things signage and banners and everything for 25 minutes of an hour and a half meeting of the top six leaders in a very quite large church. And so I feel like the person leading the meeting, when it begins to rabbit trail or go down into all the minutia, you have to take control of the meeting. And a couple of ways to do that is one, hey, great discussion. Can you offline this with our children's person and you guys make some, have a meeting, get decisions. Feel free to report back to us, but this isn't really, why we're meeting today, or we don't want to spend too much time down in the weeds. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I think sometimes I would say is like, hey, we've got more important things right now for us to discuss. So I'm going to put a pin or push pause on that conversation. So again, to me, this goes back to who's leading the meeting. And it's my job to make sure that the key things that are most important that we're getting accomplished in that meeting. And so it can be a little uncomfortable to cut people off. But I think if you're leading the meeting and you're responsible for getting the desired outcomes, sometimes you're going to have to do that. And then
Yeah.
again, I think it normalizes, like, hey, it's okay that if we didn't get to spend all the time on the thing I wanted, that's okay. We normalize that we get redirected from time to time.
Yeah. I was in a meeting recently with a great leader, and he had what he called a park it sheet.
Yes.
So if you brought something up that wasn't on message, that wasn't part of the agenda, he would say, brilliant. It's a great question. That's a great thought. I'm going to stick it on the parquet and we'll pick it up offline, as you say, Lance, or we'll pick it up next week's meeting. Right now, we need to stay on track. That's great. A couple more questions, Lance, before we wrap up. Really, really good questions here. Sam, who lives in Dublin in Ireland, how do you navigate what's urgent um, uh, and what's important when it comes to meeting? How do you prioritize the agenda? Because there's, in church life, there's everything's important, but what is
Right.
actually urgent? How do you make those priority?
Yeah. Well, and I would say sometimes this is why you wear the hat of a leader or senior leader in your church. Sometimes you've got to make the call
Yeah,
around what is most important. Sometimes, and I'll have sometimes people submit things to an agenda and I go, there's no way we're going to get to all this. And I have to make the judgment call on what's important enough for us to spend time on and what's not. The other thing I think for that comes to my mind, Duncan, when I think about urgent and important is this issue of tactical and strategic.
Yeah.
Tactical usually falls in the category of urgent, right? It's coming up this Sunday, and we've got to get some clarity around, something that we're doing for this coming weekend service. That feels urgent, and it matters. But the really important stuff, usually there's fewer of those things. They're more forward thinking, like it's really important, like what is our philosophy around small group ministry? Well, that's not urgent, it's important, but it needs a different space,
Yeah.
I think, to have the right conversations for the stuff that's important. So when I was at Saddleback, three of our so once a week we met, and three of our four meetings in a month were tactical, largely dealing with pressing issues. But once a month, we had only two or three things that we dealt with, but they were more forward thinking, long term, out in the future. And I would have categorized those as more in the more important, but not urgent category.
Yeah. I like that. I like the idea of discerning what's strategic and what's tactical, because sometimes you need the tactical, what's happening this Sunday meetings, and sometimes
Absolutely.
30,000 foot, should we rearrange our small group system? Really good. A couple more questions and then we'll wrap. What about meeting frequency when you
Uh,
were in church leadership?
yeah, I think that's great.
Daily, weekly, monthly?
I think it should be evaluated depending on, like, say, for example, if I have a team and I've got some new members on the team, maybe it is important that we meet every week. But then once we all, like, I have confidence they all get the DNA of the church, the values, we're all clear on the vision, that maybe we move that to, a bi-weekly kind of rhythm. So I think it's something to evaluate all the time. The other thing I'm always evaluating, Duncan, is not only frequency, but length of meeting. Like, do we really need a whole hour or an hour and a half to get this done? Because we'll fill up 20, 30 minutes with just chit chat. And again, I don't mind doing a 3, 4 minute check in with a group, but I'm going to make sure we get to. So I'm going like maybe we don't need an hour. Maybe we need 50 minutes, or maybe we could do it in 30 minutes. Also, maybe we don't need an in person meeting. Maybe this can be handled via text message or email or something. So I think constantly evaluating, because I go, hey, if you could buy back 30 minutes a week over the course of a year, how many extra hours is that? And so for me, this is a stewardship issue. And I'm constantly driving to have enough time to get things done, but I don't want to waste time. So again, if
Yeah.
I can buy back 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes over, in that meeting over the course of a month, I buy back some good time.
Yeah. You talked a lot about Lencioni. I can remember being at a conference and he was speaking and he was talking about meetings. And he said, have you ever tried doing a standing up meeting?
Yeah.
Meeting. I put it into practice. And I can remember we had these 15, 20-minute stand up meetings at the start of the day. When everyone's standing and no one's sitting, it's amazing how
Yeah.
quick you can rattle through what you need to rattle through. Everyone feels included, but people want to get on because I'm standing up,
Yeah.
ready to go. So,
Yep.
yeah, if it's just an information meeting, there's no reason why it can't be a 15, 20-minute stand-up meeting. Yeah, very good.
Absolutely.
Another great question from Andy here, which is really helpful. He says we often set agendas for meetings, but we don't assign timings for each point. Should we be doing so as a discipline? If you've got 10 points, should you be saying this one's 5 minutes, this one's 15 minutes, this one's a half an hour? Would that help?
Yeah. It's just so funny you should bring this up, because in the meeting I was in this week, they had decided they needed to be like have more like be more specific about the time allotment for each thing. So the guy actually bought a big clock with a big face and a digital timer. And honestly, it felt awkward. It just felt like, because he was resetting the clock all the time and playing with the buttons. And it's like, I feel like as the leader, I probably need to internally assign that. Or if I've done my homework and go, hey, we've got 5 items, let's take, because again, I'm assessing like, how important is this? How much time does it take? So I'm going to like ahead of time decide, and then I may go, hey guys, let's give this 15 minutes and then we can decide if we need more time. But if we do, it's going to hijack another item that we need to get to. So I would probably do that ahead of time rather than in the meeting try to do that. And again, I find myself putting more responsibility and more ownership on the facilitator of the meeting to really make all that stuff happen.
Do you find as well? So I could sit here all day. It's so wise, the answers you're coming with. Do you find as well sometimes there are pastors, there are leaders who are brilliant pastors, brilliant communicators, brilliant leaders, but they're not the best at facilitating good meetings. And so, is
100%.
is it ever wrong for the pastor or the leader to say, "Hey, I've asked Lance or Sheila or Bob to lead this meeting," and then they're great facilitators. They'll get us through the agenda
Yeah.
quicker and better.
Yeah, I think honestly, again, this is just between us, Duncan. Most senior pastors are not great facilitators.
Yeah.
Um, they tend to be a little more on the visionary side and like a tight meeting agenda and getting all the writing down the decisions and like that's not their thing, and that's okay. So, like in the meeting I was in 2 days ago, the executive pastor actually facilitated the meeting, which I think if you have another more organizationally minded, maybe someone who loves like an agenda and keeping the flow and keeping track of things, like put that person to facilitate the meeting. But here's the one caveat I would throw in here. You still, I think if you're, and I did this when I would lead meetings with Rick Warren in the room, my job is to help serve him.
Yeah.
And so even though he may not be facilitating the meeting, I still look at it as though it's his meeting. And I want to make sure, like I would, if I was leading the meeting and on behalf of my senior pastor, I would want to check in pretty regularly and go, hey, is this meeting helpful? Is the style of the meeting helpful to you? Are we getting done what you want to get done as a senior pastor, even though you're not facilitating?
Yeah, yeah. I jotted down some of the things people had put in the chat right at the start, Lance, when we asked them what their pet peeves were. And the interesting thing is, everything you said answers most of those pet peeves. So people have put things like, how do you make sure people follow through on what's been said? And how do you stop people getting distracted and on other devices? How do you stop vague outcomes? How do you get everybody to participate? And all those questions, I mean, honestly, if all we took away from what you've said this afternoon, Lance, if all we took away is those first two questions you say we should pose in the last 10 minutes of a meeting, it would revolutionize our meetings. You said
Yeah,
at the end of every meeting, we should say, what did we decide? And what's the decision and what's the discussion? I mean,
yeah,
honestly, if we were just to say, so what have we decided here today? I mean, it's important that we kicked the meeting off. We took off well by talking about what the win is and what our
right.
outcomes are. Of course it is. But if we get to the end of the meeting and say, so what have we decided? And everybody weighs in on that. And then someone says, whoa, hang on a minute. I still think, well, we can say, well, that's a discussion. We'll keep that going tomorrow or next week or whatever. But just those two questions would revolutionize our meetings and answer all those pet peeves that so many of us have. Mate, this has been so helpful. If you're a lead pastor in our network or you're part of a network church, we have this rare privilege where we get to spend half an hour, just us, in the same room as Lance, and we can ask him some of the ruder questions that I don't know who he is. Somebody called Jim Gallagher on the text earlier on said, "Has Lance read every one of those books?" Such a rude thing to say. So we can pick that. Jim's the chairman of our board. You have to be careful what you say around him. But we'll pick some of those more personal questions up when we're in the other room. If you go into the lead pastor chat in our WhatsApp chat, you'll find the link to that, and we'll do that. But just to remind you, Lance is going to be here on the 19th and 20th of May. It's going to be in the UK, and we have the privilege of spending those 2 days with him. So if you're near in shooting distance of Milton Keynes on the 20th, we'd love to spend the day with you. Matt's going to put into the chat the link so you can register for that. It's free. You can bring your team. We'll even give you coffee and tea and a bit of lunch. And if you're anywhere near Chorley, which isn't so far away from Bolton, I mean, it's hitting distance from Liverpool and Manchester and those kind of northern towns and cities. If you're there on the 19th, Tuesday, the 19th of May, and these 2 days, Lance is going to do what he's done for us this afternoon. He's going to be incredibly inspirational, but incredibly practical as well. And it's going to help us to be the kind of leaders that make a big impact I mean, Rick Warren made a big impact around the world. So how can you be that kind of person, but also be healthy and not crash and burn? And how many times have we seen some of these high-profile leaders in our country, in Lance's country, crash and burn because they weren't healthy on the inside? So how do we change the world by breakfast tomorrow morning while remaining healthy? That's what we're going to spend the day doing. And when Lance came to the UK last time, we had him with about 20 leaders in London. And I was inundated after that saying, Duncan, Further Faster have put lots of events on. This has been without a doubt the best. So I'm so excited that Lance is going to be in the country with us talking about that. Before Lance comes on May the 13th, it's our next How To Hub. And you can sign up and register for that already. Again, Matt will put that in the chat for us. We've got, have you ever heard this guy called Jason Perkins, Lance?
I have. I happen to know him well.
Well, he's coming next time round and he's going to talk about church hurt. Tell me a leader who hasn't gone through a little bit of church hurt.
Mm.
His story is, well, you know his story. His story is really quite painful. How people can be so mean and nasty to their own kind is difficult to understand. But he's going to talk about church hurt and how he overcame it and give us some real practical help, some tips on the kind of things that we can do if it comes our way or if we're in the midst of it right now. So if you know someone who's going through that kind of thing, invite them to hear Jason talk about that. That's May the 13th. That's the only difference about that is all our calls are at 1 o'clock. But if we did it at 1 o'clock, it would be about, I don't know, midnight for poor Jason. So we've dragged that one forward because Jason's in Brisbane, Australia. We've dragged that one forward to an 11 a.m. So mark your diaries for 11 a.m. on May the 13th so that it's late in the evening, not the middle of the night for poor Jason. So 11 a.m. May the 13th with Perko talking about church hurt. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lance. Thank you for everybody who's jumped on the call. And we'll see you all again in 2 or 3 minutes back on the other link. And if you're not part of our network and if there's anything we can do to serve you, our passion, our mission is to help church leaders. We love church leaders and we want to do everything we can to help you thrive and reach unchurched people. And so whatever we can do to help you do that, we'd love to have a conversation with you. Check us out, go to our website, look at our social media, and you'll get an idea of who we are. And if it sounds interesting, hit us up and we'll have a conversation and see what we can do to help you in your church. Anyway, thanks for being part of the webinar today. If you're part of our network, we'll see you all again in 2 or 3 minutes on the other link. Thanks, everybody.